In this lecture module, we're going to pivot our attention towards those four mechanisms by which our brain assigns cognitive significance or meaning to our perceptions, our experiences, our ideas, our words. And we're focused in this module on the first two, emotive meaning and cognitive meaning. But in doing so, I want to be careful not to propagate this portrayal that you often find in popular culture of reason and emotion as being separate entities, often in an antagonistic relationship with one another, reason fighting emotion, emotion fighting reason. This sort of view you find in shows like Star Trek, but it goes all the way back to the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, who would portray reason and emotion at odds with one another. Reason would be the charioteer trying to guide the unruly horses that were his emotions. And as we'll see, this view isn't really quite what's going on with emotive and cognitive meaning. Emotive and cognitive meaning are processed by two what psychologists call partially dissociable brain systems. That means they're not completely capable of being pulled apart and operating independently of one another. They can operate semi-independently, but they never quite get pulled apart completely. And so when we think about the relationship between cognition and emotion, between reason and emotion, we shouldn't think of it as these two separate independent entities that are often in this antagonistic relationship. Instead, we should think about it as two separate parallel processing streams, both of them making contributions to our understanding of a situation, of a word, of an idea, of a perception. But their contributions are sometimes orthogonal to one another. Sometimes they're not quite coherent or consistent with one another. And this is where the ambiguity between emotion and reason comes into play and can cause problems. So when we think about cognitive meaning, we're abstracting away from our actual brain processing and how it's much more integrated and just focusing on this idea of pure information processing, stripped of any normative, evaluative, or emotive context, the sort of thing that is often portrayed in Vulcans or robots. It's just the facts. There is no feeling, there is no evaluative content, there is no normativity in this way. When we think about emotive meaning, it's the same sort of abstraction here, going away from the way we actually function to talk about this abstract way of characterizing the contribution that this processing stream gives every moment of every day in everything that we do. Emotive meaning, then, is the visceral response one has to a truth expressed in a statement, to an experience, to an idea, to a word. And it's captured by this idea of how it makes you feel. And so in popular culture, these things are sort of misportrayed and stereotyped. In Star Trek The Next Generation, we had Data, the robot who had no emotions, who was pure reason. And then we had the stereotypically and sexistly scripted Counselor Troy, who could feel things. It was an empath. But in reality, everyone is processing emotional and cognitive information, integrating it in their perceptions, in their actions all the time. Only occasionally do they veer off into orthogonal relationships with one another that can cause the kind of ambiguity that can be problematic. And so when we think about emotive and cognitive meaning, we want to be careful not to portray them in those stereotypical or scripted ways. That isn't to say that there isn't potential for ambiguity and error and confusion when these two processing streams are making contributions that aren't completely consistent with each other. So problems oftentimes will arise when the emotive content of a statement influences one's beliefs or actions in ways that are inconsistent with the cognitive content. And this was illustrated nicely by an experiment that researchers did where they got a bunch of doctors and medical students together, and they gave them these descriptions of cases, and they gave them these descriptions of treatments that you might recommend for the cases, and they asked them what they would do. Now, these doctors are very bright people. They're trained in diagnosis. They're trained in statistics. They know all about all of the aspects of the tasks that they have to do. And what they did was for some of those doctors and medical students, they would say, look, here's our case, here's the treatment. The treatment has a 95% mortality rate. Would you recommend that treatment for your patient? And would you be worried about it? How confident would you be in doing it? And so on. The other half of these medical students and doctors were given the same description of the case, and they were given the same treatment, except the treatment was described as, we've got this treatment and it has a 5% chance of survival, of cure. How confident would you be in recommending it? How affirmative would you be? How likely would you be to recommend it? And what we discovered is, even though 95% mortality is the exact same outcome as 5% survival, when described using that phrase with that negative valence, 95% mortality, the doctors and medical students were much less likely to recommend taking that course of action with the patient, much less confident in doing it. And when it was recommended using that positive valence, given that positive emotional tinge, they were much more likely to recommend it and to be much more comfortable in recommending it, because it was a chance for life as opposed to a sentence of death. And these are people who are trained to think about these cases, right? Who are familiar with statistics and diagnosis and treatment regimens and the whole 9 yards. And yet still they couldn't separate these things out when there was this emotional tinge introduced that was inconsistent with what the data recommended to them. And in fact, I'll show you a couple of movies to illustrate how often this happens. Our perceptions of our experiences can be consistent with our understanding of them cognitively, but they can also be divergent from them. And so, for example, this researcher, Rosen, gave subjects some brownies. They say, here's a little square brownie. Would you like that? Oh, yes, I'd love a square brownie. He goes, oh, that was delicious. Would you like another? Yeah, it was good. I'd really like another one. Okay, this isn't the same batch and everything, but we shaped these into dog feces shape. Do you want one? No, I'm good. It turned out that just the perception, the association with contamination, or with something that had a negative valence like that, that was enough to push people away from it, even though they cognitively recognized that it was just another brownie. He did all sorts of variations on this. So he would have students mix up 2 glasses of sugar water, same sugar, same water, the whole 9 yards. And then he would say, hey, look, I want you to put these 2 decals on your glasses. This decal says poison, and this decal, it says sugar water. And so they put them on, and then he'd ask them to choose one of the cups and drink it. And invariably, they would want to drink the one that said sugar water. And so he'd say, no, why don't you take the one that says poison? No, I'd rather take the one that says sugar water. You know they're the same, right? Oh, sure, I know that. He would take cockroaches, and he'd autoclave them. He'd sterilize them, put them in a drink. He'd pull them out again, and he'd ask someone if they'd want to drink it after they watched him do that. And he'd explain to them there are no germs, there's no contamination whatsoever. Never in a million years will I do that. So in the next lecture module, I'll show you 2 examples of this in movies where you don't have to listen to my voice.